Hey guys, so today you and I are going to talk about contextual values. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, hi Frederick, I have a small technical idea for a possible video. In a real world scenario, how should date and time be stored in a database? How should datetime travel from the front end to the back end database? Should it be in UTC or stored without a time zone? Is there a use case when the datetime should be stored without a time zone? Thanks. So I'm just gonna give you this as for full disclosure here, guys. There is a few ways of doing this, and depending on your use case, you're gonna have to understand what's gonna be the right thing for you. I'm just gonna give you the standard thing, like the boilerplate thing that default for all the people who don't have like a special use case, which is kind of funny because I found that the Java library actually, well, it might just be that I've used it for old version of the API, but they actually don't store. They actually do append the time zone to the string output. You can probably configure that away, but I just remember that being a big hassle at my last job, because basically we had to undo what the library was doing by default because we had to store the time zone. Now let me explain why storing time zones is on average a bad idea. So the thing is, the reason why I call this a contextual value video or something like that is because let's just define first and foremost what I mean by a contextual value. A contextual value is a value that, depending on circumstances, will have different meaning. Time is one such thing, because the time where you are right now does not mean the same thing in another region of the world. That's why we have time zones as an example. It's the same thing with currency. Money, whatever money you're using, has a certain value at your specific place in your specific moment, but in 10 years or in another country or something like that, the semantics of what that number means will change. Now, when you know that you have a value that has a meaning that changes depending on the context, you have a few options. Now, this is actually funny because one of the best things ever, if I remember correctly, it was, what was it? Effective Java version 2 or something like that, where they actually have this thing. I can't remember now exactly which book it is, but it's a Java book where the author very well illustrates the value of domain-driven design and like how to capture objects with types and so forth. Because basically the author is shows you the problem with money calculations. Because if you let's just imagine that you have dollars and you have euros or something like that. Now, if you store both of those values in your system, every single time you want to do anything with the money in your system, you have to make sure that you have an instance that is equal to the other. Because if you must check every single time if a money value or a cost or whatever you might have that represents your money in the system, if that is the right type. Do you have the right currency unit? Because if you don't, and you by mistake convert dollars in euros and you calculate them just without accounting for things such as, you know, like what is the stock market and like all of this stuff, you will have the wrong value. Now, this time is the same thing. Now, the reason why most people, at the very least in my experience, store the UTC value is because it is the value that you can use as a base value. What is a base value? Well, I'm glad you asked. A base value is a value that you can use in order to calculate other values. It's like having a base class, an abstract class. It's not something that you in of itself necessarily you're going to use and represent to a user or something like that, but it's just the value that you use to calculate the other stuff. So an example, if you have a timestamp that is just, you know, the milliseconds, the UTC millisecond value. Now that number doesn't mean anything to a user, but from that number you can show the user the UTC time, you can calculate any time zone basically, because you have a base value that is precise enough that you can do the other calculations. Same thing goes for money. Instead of storing in, say, dollars, you should store in the base value, which is cents. Well, I hope so. I'm not an American, but hopefully it's going to be cents. I hope you understand what I'm going for. You find a value that is precise enough, not too precise, because then you're going to have a real problem if you have like highly precise numbers, which is a whole different video. But usually you're going for, say, in time seconds or milliseconds or something like that, and storing that value, because then you can calculate everything else. And then you have one more rule to follow, and that is to always use the same type of value in the entire system. I'll give you an example. I've worked with money systems before in a few companies, and the one rule that there was always one specific rule that we followed, and that was that we chose in one, like just an arbitrary, usually like an arbitrary base value that was in the case of money it was cents, or here in Sweden it was crowns. We had for translations it's the same thing. Usually people go with English, so that's the base, that's like the master language that everybody uses, and then that's the thing you store, and all the other translations or all the other money values or whatever you're doing is converted from that base to whatever it's supposed to be. So if you're storing cents, well, and you want to go to euros, well, doesn't matter if you're in Europe or like whatever country you're using, you're always converting whatever currency someone is using in a specific country to cents and storing cents, because then the conversion is very simple. Because if you don't do that and you mix dollars and euros or dollars and francs or whatever you're using, you have a much bigger problem, because now you need to make sure that you know how to convert every value from every other value, and that's much more complicated than just storing one value, one very easy value that where the conversion is easy, and then just using that. And that's why UTC is a very nice one, because you don't have to care about the time zone. You don't have to care about the time zone you're storing. It's very simple. You just store the UTC value, and then you have to know what time zone you are in when you're doing the conversion. Same thing with the money thing, right? You just store cents, euros, whatever you're using, a small value that is precise enough, and then you do the conversion. So what I want you to take away from this is that usually people consider UTC to be one of the best values, at least for time, to store. I'm not going to dive into, do you store the UTC time string, or do you store like the millisecond value, like the actual number? I'll leave that up to you, because it depends a little bit. But the basic idea is that these sorts of contextual values that change meaning depending on where you are or like circumstances, just pick one that has enough precision and use that as the base, and then everything is a conversion to and from that base type within your entire system. That way you only have to know about how to convert one thing to another thing, rather than having multiple things that can be converted. And that's because that's just a much more problematic thing to do. There's more complexity to it. This is at the very least what I've seen. I would go as far as to say I think that this is like the normal way most software companies do time and money and language translations and stuff like that. I've worked in several companies with these sorts of issues, and it's always the same thing. You pick one. If it's translations English or something like that. If it's money, it's either like the country's currency or whatever, and then everything else is a conversion. Have a great day.